But one of the most popular theories is that it had a more mystical function. Perhaps it was used in divination or sorcery or fortune-telling.
Scientists just analyzed the world's most intact Roman dodecahedron ever found, and what they found inside it terrified everyone. The X-rays were made by Dr. Richard Hobbs, who had spent 17 years working in archaeological imaging and materials analysis, and according to him, he ran the results 3 times, and every time it pointed toward a chemical, calcium phosphate, along with an isotope pattern that is consistent with human bones. But that was only the beginning. When researchers from the University of Leicester tracked the locations of all 130 discovered dodecahedrons, a chilling pattern emerged. Most of them were found at locations linked with burials, sacred sites, and ancient rituals involving the dead. So, what exactly was the dodecahedron used for in those dark traditions? And why were the Romans so terrified of it that they left not a single clue about it in their records? Let's find out. The discovery. In June 2023, archaeologists arrived at Potter Hill, near Norton Disney in Lincolnshire, to study the remains of a Roman settlement dating back nearly 2,000 years. The excavation was being run by the Norton Disney History and Archaeology Group, with professional archaeologists from Allen Archaeology supervising the work. 4 trenches had been opened across the site, but Trench 4 was the one that would change the entire excavation. It had only been opened during the final days of the dig, and the team had very little time left. Then, while working through the soil, Richard Howlett, one of the local volunteers helping with the excavation, struck something hard with his trowel. He stopped and cleared the dirt away by hand. A dull bronze surface appeared beneath the soil. At first, it looked like another Roman object, but as more of it emerged, Howlett realized he wasn't looking at a coin, a tool, or anything the team had expected to find there. As the shape became clear, there was no mistaking what they had found. It was a Roman dodecahedron, a 12-sided bronze object with carefully formed pentagonal faces, circular openings, and small knobs at its corners. But there was something unusual about this one. More than 130 Roman dodecahedrons have now been found across Europe. But the problem is, most of them were discovered before modern archaeologists could properly document the sites where they were found. Normally, archaeologists study what an object was buried with, how deep it was buried, what kind of soil surrounded it, and what other objects or remains were nearby. All of that context can reveal what an object was used for. But with many dodecahedrons, that context was already gone. The Norton Disney specimen was different. It was the first known dodecahedron from the English Midlands, and it was unusually large, finely made, and almost completely intact. More importantly, archaeologists had found it exactly where it had been placed, with its archaeological context still around it. Lorena Hitchens, a Newcastle University researcher studying these mysterious objects for her PhD, called the find exceptional. Then archaeometallurgist Jerry McDonnell examined the bronze using X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, a technique that can identify the elements in an alloy without damaging it. The result raised an immediate question. The dodecahedron was made from roughly 75% copper, 18% lead, and 7% tin. It wasn't some crude piece of scrap metal. It had been made from a carefully controlled alloy, shaped into an incredibly complex form by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. But if someone had gone to that much trouble to make it, what were they making it for? What was its purpose? That was the question that had puzzled historians for centuries. But now, for perhaps the first time, researchers had a dodecahedron whose condition and archaeological context gave them a real chance of answering it. Because the object was hollow, researchers believed its inner walls might preserve traces of whatever the dodecahedron had once been used for. So Dr. Lorena Hitchens and archaeometallurgist Jerry McDonnell continued examining the specimen, while samples taken from its interior were sent to Oxford's radiochemistry unit for more specialized analysis. In early 2024, that deeper investigation finally produced a clue. It was small, but it pointed toward a possibility far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The disturbing clue, March 2024. Dr. Marcus Hole had been sitting in Oxford's radiochemistry lab, staring at the results from one of the most advanced scans ever performed on the Norton Disney dodecahedron. He had already examined the object from almost every possible angle. Now, the team was using techniques capable of detecting microscopic traces left behind on its surface, even after nearly 2,000 years. Hole expected another ordinary result: traces of soil, corrosion, or the natural chemicals that build up on ancient bronze. Instead, the scan showed something he couldn't explain. Taken aback by what he was seeing, he called Dr. Elena Voss into the lab, and when she looked at the results, she was just as shocked. The first clue was burnt organic material trapped around the object's interior. There were carbon particles and oxidized copper salts, suggesting that something had been exposed to intense heat close to the bronze. That alone was strange, but the chemical analysis went further. The researchers reported traces of animal blood proteins, and alongside them were residues of plants including lavender, thyme, pine resin, and fir resin. These were not random substances. Some had been used in ancient European funerary and purification practices, including traditions associated with both Roman and Celtic communities. That changed the question. The team was no longer simply asking what a dodecahedron could have been used for. They were looking at evidence that something had actually been burned or prepared around one. One possibility became especially disturbing. Some of the chemical patterns partially matched substances used in ancient embalming mixtures, preparations made to treat or preserve the bodies of the dead. But that only made the mystery stranger. What could this bizarre bronze object possibly have to do with funerals? Surprisingly, the answer came from a completely different line of investigation, one that had nothing to do with the traces at all. Researchers at Oxford and the University of Ghent began recreating dodecahedrons to understand what their strange openings could actually do. Some replicas were made from bronze, others from resin. Under direct sunlight, the holes projected circular beams that shifted as the object was rotated and as the sun moved across the sky. And that clearly showed that the dodecahedron may have been connected to specific dates, seasons, or rituals. So, by this point, a theory started to form. Maybe this ancient object was used during a funeral ritual held at a specific time of year. But that still didn't explain the traces inside it. Something had clearly been exposed to fire. Blood proteins were present, and chemical traces from plants associated with funerals had also been detected. So what were all of these things really hinting toward? And even more importantly, what exactly had been burned inside that bronze object? What was burned inside it? To answer that question, Dr. Marcus Hole went back to the residue from the Norton Disney specimen for a deeper analysis. And this time, the team focused on its chemical composition. But the deeper they went, the stranger the results became. Again and again, the analysis kept pointing toward a chemical that shouldn't have been there: calcium phosphate. It is a mineral compound found naturally in bone. That meant the material wasn't simply ash from plants or resin. Something containing bone had been exposed to intense heat inside, or very close to, the bronze object. But the presence of calcium phosphate didn't solve the mystery. Because it could have come from livestock, birds, or another animal used in an ancient ritual, So the researchers needed to know exactly what kind of bone they were looking at. Holl's team compared the chemical signature against known bone material and examined the isotope pattern in greater detail. The analysis was repeated 3 times, but the result kept pointing in the same direction. The calcium phosphate was not consistent with ordinary animal remains. The isotope signature matched cremated human bone. In simple words, the traces matched the bones of a person whose body had been burned after death. That was the moment the investigation changed completely. Holl reportedly showed the results to other researchers, and none of them spoke for several moments. Because, until then, the dodecahedron could still have been explained as some unusual instrument, a container, or even an object connected to animal sacrifice. But human remains were different. If the material really had come from a cremated person, then the dodecahedron had not simply been placed near a ritual. It may have been directly involved in one. And suddenly, several earlier discoveries began to look very different. The burnt organic material, the traces of blood, the lavender, thyme, pine resin, and fir resin, the possible funerary compounds, and now microscopic traces of cremated human bone inside a hollow bronze object. But it didn't end there. When the researchers went back to the archaeological records and examined where other dodecahedrons had been found, the story became much more haunting. One discovery could have been strange. 2 could have been a coincidence. But when the same pattern started appearing across different sites, coincidence became much harder to explain. But if these objects were repeatedly turning up around places associated with the dead, and one of them contained the remains of a cremated human being, then the question was no longer simply, what was the dodecahedron? It was something much darker. What kind of ritual required a bronze object, fire, blood, and the remains of the dead? The forbidden ritual. To understand what kind of ritual involved all these bizarre things, we need to go back to pre-Roman Europe. From roughly 750 BC to the 1st century BC, much of Western Europe was home to the people we now call Celts. They were not one nation or a single empire, but dozens of different tribes and communities, including the Arverni, Iceni, and Sequani. These tribes spread across a huge area and were connected by related languages, customs, art, and religious traditions. But what matters most here is that their spiritual world was completely different from Rome's. The Celts believed certain places could have supernatural importance. Springs, rivers, forests, burial grounds, and deep underground spaces could all become places for offerings and ceremonies. And this isn't just something historians have guessed. Archaeologists have actually found the remains of those rituals buried at these sites. At the Source de la Seine in modern France, for example, excavations uncovered thousands of wooden and stone objects representing eyes, arms, legs, and internal organs. These were offerings to Sequana, a goddess associated with the spring, often connected to requests for healing. But these rituals were not carried out by ordinary people alone. They were guided by a powerful class of religious specialists, the Druids. They were far more than priests. Roman writers described them as religious authorities, judges, teachers, healers, and keepers of sacred knowledge. They led ceremonies, interpreted signs and omens, settled disputes, and passed important teachings from one generation to the next. And that's where the clash began. When Rome entered these lands, some of these traditions were no longer just strange foreign customs. To Roman authorities, they could become a threat. Rome was willing to accept foreign gods when they could be brought into the official religious system. But private divination, curses, magical practices, and secret rituals outside Roman control were treated very differently. And Rome didn't just disapprove of them, it made laws against them. One of the important examples was the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Veneficis, a Roman law first passed in 81 BC. Its original purpose was to punish murderers and poisoners, but its reach later extended to veneficium, a broad term associated with harmful magic, poisonous mixtures, and other illicit practices. And the punishments could be severe. Wealthier offenders could have their property seized and be exiled to an island, while people of lower status could face execution, including being thrown to wild animals or crucified. Rome, meanwhile, was determined to control exactly the kind of supernatural practices that existed outside its authority. And when researchers compared those traditions with the traces found inside the dodecahedron, the connection became difficult to ignore. But there was still a problem. Celtic-style evidence did not prove the object was Celtic. Because after Rome conquered these regions, Roman and local traditions began to blend together. So a ritual object found in a Roman settlement could have come from either tradition or from both. To understand the true purpose of the dodecahedron, scientists needed concrete evidence, and that evidence came from something nobody had carefully noticed before: the map showing where these objects had been found. The map changes everything. So far, roughly 130 dodecahedrons have been identified across the former Roman world, and around 33 have come from Britain alone. But when researchers placed those discoveries on a map, something strange appeared. The objects were concentrated in the northwestern provinces of Rome, and the closer researchers looked, the sharper the boundary became. The dodecahedrons largely stopped around the Alpine region. There was no authenticated Roman dodecahedron from Italy, Spain, Greece, or North Africa. That was difficult to explain. The roughly 130 Roman dodecahedrons all belong to the Roman period. But archaeologists have also found earlier 12-sided objects, including a bone example from Castione della Presolana, dating to around the 5th century BC, and a bronze example near Padua from the 4th century BC. These weren't Roman dodecahedrons, but they proved the 12-sided form existed in Europe centuries before Roman expansion. So the Roman examples may have inherited an older tradition rather than creating it. If so, then what about the name? Why is it called the Roman dodecahedron? The answer is actually simpler than it sounds. Almost all known examples were found in Roman-era sites, so archaeologists classified them as Roman based on their archaeological context. But that didn't necessarily mean the Romans had invented them. And when all the evidence is put together, the picture becomes far clearer. The ritual clues pointed toward Celtic traditions. The geographic pattern pointed toward former Celtic territories. And the existence of similar objects centuries before Roman expansion suggested that the idea itself did not begin with Rome. All of it pointed toward one possibility. These dodecahedrons were actually Celtic. But even if that mystery was solved, the researchers were still left with two much bigger questions. What exactly did the Celts use these dodecahedrons for? And why is there almost complete silence about them in the Roman record? The final truth. When researchers finally had all the information and connections in front of them, they were left with one task: put everything together and determine what this strange object had actually been used for. And when they did, all those separate clues pointed toward one of the most feared practices of the ancient Celtic world: necromancy. Unlike Hollywood movies, ancient Celtic necromancy was not about raising corpses from their graves. It was a ritual meant to contact the dead and seek knowledge from them. They believed the dead could reveal things hidden from the living, answers about the future, lost knowledge, or questions no living person could answer. And suddenly, the strange evidence inside the dodecahedron became much harder to dismiss. There were traces consistent with cremated human bone inside it. Researchers also found residues from smoke-producing substances that may have been burned during the ritual. We cannot know exactly how the ritual was performed, but the possibility is chilling. And that brings us to the second mystery. Why did Rome leave almost nothing about it? After all, the Romans were one of the most meticulous record-keeping civilizations of the ancient world. So why did they leave not even a single clue about an object found more than 130 times across the former Roman world? Their writers documented emperors, wars, laws, taxes, foreign peoples, religious ceremonies, unusual customs, and even practices they considered barbaric. So why did they leave not even a single clue about an object found more than 130 times across the former Roman world? According to historians, there could be two possibilities. First, perhaps the dodecahedron was simply too ordinary to deserve a mention. Second, it may have been connected to practices that were considered too dangerous, private, or outside Roman control to document. And in the case of the dodecahedron, the second possibility makes far more sense. They may have seen it being used in a practice they considered too dangerous and contrary to Roman religious beliefs, so they simply left it out of their records. So, here we are. What was once dismissed as a mysterious Roman object may actually have been a Celtic ritual tool meant for communicating with the dead. So, after hearing it all, what do you think? Which of the clues mentioned in the video surprised you the most? And do you also think the dodecahedron was really used to communicate with the dead? Let us know what you think about this in the comments below. And if you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more incredible videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.